So while folks are just coming in, we'll just hang out for a little bit. Still a few folks joining. Looks like we've settled down. So good evening. Welcome to the fourth community workshop. These workshops are really designed to review materials that we've already presented at special board meetings or regularly scheduled board meetings, and provides the public really with an opportunity to interact with the project team in a little bit less of a formal setting than a regular public meeting would be. So there'll be opportunities for questions this evening, more than one if you choose. And so for those of you on your smartphone or smart device, it's using the raised hand feature. And if you're on the phone, I think it's *9 to raise your hand. And we'll get to those questions, all of the questions tonight. Just as I think about the project and some of the comments that we've been seeing and hearing, I did want to just reflect a little bit and maybe a perspective. You know, Armin, I think last time noted that the end is in sight. And, you know, whenever you get toward the end of something, everybody starts to feel rushed and that they've, you know, there's sort of an anxiety that you've got to get everything correct and done before the end, before decisions are final and made. I do just want to reflect that this is maybe the end of the very first step in the process that we're undertaking, which is this journey to water supply resiliency. And so the strategic water supply assessment has, you know, it's identified a number of water supply or water management alternatives. And the most promising of those alternatives are going to end up in what we're referring to as the roadmap. And there are, you know, I'm hearing sort of rumblings out there that the roadmap, you know, this is going to be in January, and you know, this feeling that there's going to be tens of millions of dollars expended in January. Every single one of these management alternatives that we're looking at has a lot more work to do before we can really get into, you know, implementation and serious construction of physical infrastructure where the big dollars will be spent. So there's a lot more work for us to do, and I could go into examples on every one, but I'll spare you the gory details on that. Just suffice to say that, you know, the roadmap, the strategic water supply assessment, these are steps along the way that we're taking to developing a sustainable water supply for Marin and our community. And we've got a fairly long road ahead. So with that, I think that's just sort of a perspective that we do have a fairly long way to go still in this process. And so we appreciate your patience, and we appreciate you spending time with us to learn about the process and the alternatives. I'm going to hand it over to Ben. He's got a couple of remarks tonight as well.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. We need to get on with business here, but I did want to take an opportunity just to thank everyone for joining in. We know folks are busy, and kind of from a personal perspective, we've really benefited from the level of engagement and comments and critiques that have come in, and we've worked to adaptively manage the work to address many of them the best we can. So I just want to note that the comments are important. We document all the comments, we think about them, we debate them. Many of them find their way into the project that hadn't been even considered in certain ways. So again, thank you for the participation and the support as we go through this. Also, I suppose I wanted to state the obvious that we benefit in this community from a wide range of perspectives and opinions, at times very strong opinions. And this is great, and it helps, right, to get to the best decision with these different perspectives. But it's also important to recognize that no one's right or wrong necessarily on much of this. It's just different views, different ways of looking at it. So that's kind of how, the spirit, I think, of this meeting is designed, to hear from everyone and respect all the divergent views that may come across. One issue I did want to briefly touch on that's likely to come up tonight is, and I've heard from many people on many different kind of topics in this, is that the estimated costs are just too high. And I've heard that in regards to IPR, indirect potable reuse, and direct potable reuse. I've heard it on desal, and I've heard it on conservation, and probably more of the water supply options. Personally, we've looked at these numbers a lot. I have confidence in these preliminary, and they are preliminary numbers that the teams have developed, in kind of recognition that, one, they are preliminary, and as we move forward with this effort, as Paul noted, we dive deeper into the different project elements, and the costs become more refined and tighter once we have a clearer picture of what we're doing. And then also, just to share, I don't believe in 30 plus years of working in this industry that I've ever seen a project come in under a planning level estimate, even those that feel high out of the gate. These large complex projects do have a way of costing more than you even plan for. So I'm appreciative that these numbers feel high, because I think that means they feel right, at least in the ballpark of what these costs ultimately will be. And lastly, as Paul mentioned, tonight's discussion is intended and designed to be a review of what we've brought to the board and the public to date. Not just to have the same conversations, but to give the public an opportunity to ask the questions you may have in a less formal venue, as we've done in the past workshops. And generally, there's been kind of appreciation for this. Really, we will run through the slides and then open-ended questions and answers. And we will stay, I'll stay at least, the team, as the extent we can, until all the questions are answered. And because what we want ideally is to agree on the facts, understanding that the opinions may be somewhat different. So the goal is to do the best we can on establishing kind of a foundational understanding of the facts that are out there and the key assumptions and the like. So with that, I'll turn it over to Armin Univar, who is leading the effort from Jacobs Engineering.
Thanks, Ben and Paul. Appreciate all the introduction there and the caveats. Those are really important as we move into some of the discussion here. So I'm going to share my screen, and does everything look okay to you, panelists? Yeah. Okay, great. Well, yeah, thanks for the setup. But what we wanted to do today was, like Paul mentioned, is really to review material that's been presented to the board in various sessions over the past 2 months or 2 or 3 months. Again, all the information here is still preliminary, works in progress. We're in the process of documenting much of the material into a more formal aspect. So what we're kind of sharing with you is the status of the work as it's been shared to the board. We'll talk a little bit today about the assessment overview very briefly, just remind you what we're doing and where we're at. Talk about the water management alternatives that have been characterized to date. Talk about our initial evaluation of those alternatives, the process and the initial evaluation, and then talk about where we're heading next from the standpoint of the assessment. Let's see, we are today here at the 25th Public Workshop Looking forward, today we'll talk about the work that's been done in the past. Looking forward, we're really moving towards looking towards portfolios and strategies in the month of November, and then working towards roadmaps and recommendations in December and January. So there's still some work to be done and some time to be having this discussion moving forward. Just a reminder of the process that we're undertaking here with the district. Really, we've kind of walked through these various steps of understanding the current risks and establishing the goals. We've identified some goals. We've developed scenarios. We're using a decision model to help us support in some of the analysis of system operations. We've spent an awful lot of time developing conceptual level water supply alternatives, and I would say still they're at conceptual level. So we're not yet. We're at that level, and we've done some initial evaluation of those alternatives. So for what we'll present today is a high level description of the alternatives, the kind of expected yield and cost estimates associated with them, and then an initial evaluation of those alternatives. So where we're heading is to continue that evaluation of the alternatives, and then with the recognition that there's likely to be a combination of alternatives or management actions that would have to be developed in order to fit various timescales and gaps in supply and demand, and that the various portfolios would have to be developed in order to meet the overall deficits that we're expecting. And all of that will be pulled into a roadmap, which is essentially trying to describe the range of alternatives, the timing of which some of them could be developed, and what sort of decisions might be made and the triggers for those decisions. So we've started out at a very high level looking at various water management alternatives, from demand conservation to infrastructure, new water supply alternatives, modification of existing alternatives. And we're working through a process where we're considering a broad range of alternatives and looking for kind of promising alternatives through this evaluation process. And then eventually the development of portfolios or combinations of alternatives that might lead us towards a resilient and sustainable water management solutions. So that's the kind of the highest level depiction of the process. As part of the process, we realized that there are various possibilities of future conditions. Climate change certainly provides a wealth of scenarios in which we could look at future water supply conditions. We've looked at historical hydrology. We've looked at future climate projections out through the end of century. We've looked at long-term paleoclimate information, and have stitched together various different scenarios to look at what types of stresses on the system might occur. We've developed 5 scenarios for helping this effort, and we go from looking at very short-term 2 to 3 year drought deficits to really an extensive 4-year droughts that's ends up resulting in our largest deficit. We also have longer droughts that are on the order of 6 or 7 years that are derived from the climate projections, and they offer a challenge of persistence, kind of a persistent dryness condition. And then we have one scenario where we've derived a reduced treatment capacity to reflect possibilities of conditions in the watershed, either seismic conditions or wildfire conditions that prevent the ability to fully utilize your treatment capacity. And that results in some diversification challenges. What we've been working, when we look at all 5 of those, one of the ones that is the most challenging from a deficit standpoint or a drought resiliency standpoint is scenario 3, which is roughly a 4-year drought, looking at 1920 and 21 conditions combined with 1976 and 1977 conditions. That essentially puts the two driest periods on record back to back into a 4-year drought. And then we're simulating the operation of Marin's system, the reservoirs, the demands over time under those stress test hydrologic conditions. And the way we're measuring, one of the measures that we're using to identify the stress on the system is an annual deficit. And the annual deficit is defined as essentially how the volume that would be required to maintain Marin storage at roughly 30,000 acre-feet. Their total storage capacity is around 80,000 acre-feet. So roughly 30,000 acre-feet would be held in storage. And then how much water was unavailable during that drought period to deliver and meet the demands. So when we do that calculation of how much was unavailable to meet the demands and how much water would have to be held into storage to maintain 30,000 acre-feet, we end up with estimates of somewhere on the order of 6,500 to 7,500 acre-feet per year needed over those 4 years to meet those conditions. The other scenarios produce different results here. Most of them are smaller than this value. And certainly you could hypothesize a different outcome that would result in a larger deficit than this one here. We feel this is a reasonable planning level number to start to look at the various alternatives that are out there in order to meet future conditions. So as we've gone into looking at the potential for water management alternatives to resolve that deficit, we've been looking at various categories of water management alternatives. We have categories of Sonoma-Marin partnerships, so looking at greater operation of Russian River supplies through the Sonoma water system. Local surface storage, either enhancement of augmentation of surface storage, changes in spillway gate operations, water transfers through conveyance of bay interties, desalination opportunities, recycled water opportunities, and water conservation. Those have been our 6 categories that we've been evaluating thus far. And what I'd like to do on the next several slides here is give a brief summary of the types of alternatives within those categories. So each category has a group of alternatives. Then I'll share high-level cost and yield estimates for each of those. And we'll do that for each of the 6 categories. So for the Sonoma-Marin partnership category, we're looking at 4. We've listed 5 here, but one we believe will fall off the table from our analysis. The first is looking at maximizing use of Sonoma water, essentially using existing facilities and operating with a greater desire to take water from Sonoma water, and in doing so, retain local supplies into the reservoirs for a longer period of time. That's really an operational enhancement. There is no new infrastructure needed in order to implement that project. The second one is maximizing use of Sonoma water and resolving conveyance bottlenecks. These would have would resolve some of the conveyance limitations that limit how much water could be taken from Sonoma water due to the Petaluma aqueduct constraints or constraints within Marin system at the pump stations. The third set of alternatives here is maximizing use of Sonoma water using dedicated conveyance. We're here looking at potential for dedicated conveyance from either the Petaluma aqueduct or directly from Cotati tanks to local surface water, either in Sulahuili or Nicasio reservoirs. The groundwater well rehabilitation project that's shown here in gray is a project that absolutely is supported, but it's a project that Sonoma Water is implementing largely through existing funding and will contribute to the overall regional resiliency, but is not really a project that Marin could implement directly on its own for its own water supply benefit. Certainly there'd be water supply benefit as part of the overall Sonoma Water resiliency. The last one on the list here is the Regional Groundwater Bank, and looking at creation of storage opportunities in Santa Rosa Plain, Petaluma Valley, and Sonoma Valley, and putting water in during wet periods into that newly created groundwater bank and extracting it during dry periods, and essentially using it as an off-stream storage concept for drought mitigation. So for each of those alternatives, we've identified a potential new supply that could be available during a dry year, a 4-year dry year condition. So that's what's shown in the first column where it says potential new supply. The next set of columns are about the cost estimates. So we've broken that down in terms of capital costs and annual O&M costs. And then when we combine the overall costs, bring them into an annualized cost and compare it to the new supply, we pull it into the final column, which is a cost estimate of dollars per acre foot of new supply. So you can see the amount of yields that's being expected from various aspects of Sonoma Water, from roughly 1,500 acre feet per year of new operational benefits to potentially up to 4,000 acre feet with dedicated conveyance to new storage. I'll go on to the next category is looking at local storage augmentation. So the first set is looking at local surface storage enlargement. So we've looked at the potential for enlargements of Suluhuli, Nicasio, and Kent reservoirs through a raising of the dam at each of those. We've also looked at Devil's Gulch and Halleck as potential new surface storage sites. And then we've been looking at adjustable spillway gates, and essentially how could you modify the spillways through holding back additional water and essentially gaining more storage through the operation of those new spillway gates. For each of those, again, we've looked at the new supply. So from a storage enlargement standpoint, we've looked at the potential of up to around 20,000 acre feet at either Suluhuli, Nicasio, or Kent. Not at all. We did not combine all three of them together. The new Halleck storage facilities, looking at roughly 10,000 acre feet of new storage capability at either Devil's Gulch or Halleck. And then for the adjustable spillway gates, we've currently looked at Kent, Nicasio, Suluhuli, and Alpine as potentials for operating adjustable gates at those locations. We're still in the progress of doing some further evaluation on the spillway gates to see whether indeed all 4 reservoirs could have that capability. It's likely that Alpine may fall off that list due to the configuration of the spillway. You can see also from the cost, there's quite varied cost differences here in terms of the spillway gates are at lower cost in comparison to building new reservoirs for certain. And the expansion costs are kind of next in line and within this category. The next category of options with water purchases through conveyance, with conveyance through Bay Interties. All of the options that we're considering under this grouping is looking at a potential of a temporary water transfer, purchase, and conveyance through either East Bay Mud, Contra Costa system, through the North Bay Aqueduct and Napa, or San Francisco Public Utility connection across the Golden Gate Bridge. We've made assumptions of of roughly a 20,000 acre feet temporary transfer. And we've assumed that that could be regulated and supplied over a 4-year period, thus resulting in kind of the 5,000 acre feet of yield for the East Bay Mud, Contra Costa, and North Bay Aqueduct interties. For the San Francisco Public Utility intertie, should that occur, it'll likely be limited on the service area that could be supplied from a pipeline that were to come in from essentially the lowest part of your system or for the southern part of your system in delivery. The desalination options, there are 4 groupings of desalination options. There's Marin regional desalination options, which would look at desalination plant facility in Marin. We've looked at 5, 10, and 15 MGD capability for that particular site. We've also looked at a containerized desalination facility at roughly a 5 MGD capacity. The third one here is looking at Marin partnering as part of the Bay Area Regional Desalination Facility that is been in study and partnership programs already developed. And then the final one here is looking conceptually at a new idea of Petaluma brackish water. So in this case, there'd be wells that would extract brackish water near the Petaluma River. There'd be desalination that would occur and the product water would be delivered directly. This is probably the set of options in which we've done the most detailed set of cost estimating and sensitivity analyses. We've looked at the 5, 10, and 15 MGD of the Marin regional desalination. And we've looked at them in different ways, whether they could be a 5 MGD that could be expandable to 10 MGD, a 10 MGD that could expand to 15 MGD. And then as part of the sensitivity, also wanted to look at the relative cost implications of should we do one that is not expandable, essentially a standalone. The containerized desalination facility is a facility of similar size of 5 MGD when located at the same site on Pelican Way, but all of the construction would largely be done off-site, and these containers would be placed and installed on location. With the Bay Area Regional Desalination Facility, we've also estimated that a partnership, it's a much larger plant than 5 MGD, but a partnership could produce up to 5 MGD for Marin. That partnership has not yet been explored. And then finally, the Petaluma brackish facility, we've made assumptions and estimates that we could get 5 MGD of groundwater extraction and product water. You can see the cost range is quite a bit differently across all the desalination. The brackish groundwater ones tend to be the lowest cost because the salinity in the source water is quite a bit lower than any of the other alternatives. For water reuse, we've been looking at different types of water reuse options, whether it's recycled water, so expansion of the non-potable, essentially the purple pipe systems, or Peacock Gap and San Quintin. We've looked at indirect potable reuse, basically advanced treatment and conveyance to Kent Lake. And then direct potable reuse, various sub-alternatives associated with that, either raw water augmentation, in which the Central Marin Sanitation Agency treatment plant would then provide new product water and put into Bontempi Lake, or the product water would be further treated and put directly into the distribution system. That's called treated water augmentation. And then finally, looking at a much larger scale, a direct potable reuse concept where both the CMSA, Las Colinas, and the Sanitation Agency South Marin reuse supply would be treated and put into Bontempi Lake. that's a much larger possible program. And again, first off, I'd say the recycled water expansion projects, while of critical importance, are relatively low yield with respect to, in comparison to the other alternatives. They tend to be a little bit higher cost as well because of the infrastructure required. The regional IPR program has a potential for producing some fairly sizable yield. Also, the costs are quite high for that one. And then the CMSA and the regional direct potable reuse programs also have the potential to produce fairly high yield. There's quite a bit of infrastructure associated with it, and you can see that as you move water to different parts of the system, whether you're going into reservoir storage or directly into the distribution system, costs are driven quite a bit by the conveyance and pumping costs. I think with that, I'm going to hand it to Carrie, who's going to talk about the water conservation assessments.
Yeah, thank you, Armin. Carrie Pollard, Water Efficiency Manager. So for the water conservation projects, we developed two specific scenarios, both of them looking out to water savings or potential demands in 2045, which is the planning horizon for this study. So we found in 2045, we were projecting a 15% reduction in overall demands. And those demands would result in a district-wide per capita water use of 106. That's our GPCD number we have there. So that's total water produced by the district divided by population. But when we focus in on our residential sector specifically, it would bring our GPCD down to 73 under this scenario. With each of these various programs, which I'll go into a bit of the details on the next slide, there is a cumulative water savings that result, right? So a landscape change today will continue to provide savings for the district into the future. And so the total cumulative savings for this program is about 22,000 acre feet, again, out into 2045. We also evaluated the cost. Let me jump back. We also evaluated the cost to the district, as well as the cost to the customer. So if you think about this as every one of the actions or programs that are developed in this scenario have associated water savings. And there's a cost to the district for, say, a rebate we're providing, but there's also a cost to the customer because we need our customers to participate in these programs to achieve these associated water savings. And so, say for a toilet replacement, the district provides a rebate of $150 for each fixture. There's associated water savings, but then the customer also has to pay the plumber, and maybe the toilet costs more than $150. So there's additional cost associated there. And so we attempted to quantify those costs under the customer cost, which is that last line item, which is $2,800 per acre foot. So no customer is, of course, going to have to put out $2,000 for a toilet replacement, but we're trying to quantify what that impact would be to our customers. Next slide. So looking at some of the key assumptions, right? So as I mentioned, one of the key factors that would go into quantifying the water savings for any potential program is the level of participation. And so what we have here is what we've projected as the level of participation for our programs to quantify the water savings that we're projecting. And the way we came up with these numbers is that we looked at our past annual participation pre-drought, and we also looked at our participation during the drought. And what we wanted to do is land on a conservation project participation level for this strategic water supply assessment that we have a high level of confidence that we will actually be able to achieve, right? So we're not aiming for the best and most robust level of participation because it's something we will shoot for, but it's not something we can really feel we can guarantee. And so what we wanted to do here with our levels of participation is, again, land on a number that has a high level of confidence within each of these programs that have been outlined. Going beyond, next slide, going beyond just this conservation, kind of our baseline program, if you would, we looked at, well, what else could be done within the district, again, with a high level of confidence that the savings could be achieved. And that would really end up being a regulatory driven project. So we would build on the prior project I just mentioned, and also add some regulatory aspects to achieve a higher level of water savings. What we're projecting here is that with this regulatory driven project, demands per capita demands for district wide would drop to 100 GPCD. And then for our residential sector, it would be down to about 69 gallons per capita per day. The cost for these for the district would increase to about $4,000. Our preliminary cost assessment is about $4,000 per acre foot. And this is directly tied to the amount of staff time that would be needed to enforce this regulatory driven project if adopted. Next slide. We wanted to provide a little bit more detail on what would this regulatory driven project potentially look like. It would be looking at things like establishing water budgets and associated penalties. And so water budgets is, establishing an amount of water that's an acceptable level of use for our customers within the district. We would look at expanding our water efficient landscape ordinance regulations. So specifically, this would be looking at new turf installations for both new developments and remodels and putting a limit on how much turf could be installed. We would be looking at only allowing low water use plants and drip irrigation, again, for new development and remodels. There'd be a need to achieve these water savings to have a prohibition on non-functional turf in our existing non-residential sites. So that would be our commercial sites. And also looking at potentially limiting turf in existing single family homes as well, right? Just to achieve those additional water savings that we're projecting. Looking inside, looking at fixture standards and more stringent requirements on types of fixtures that are installed would be something that would be needed to achieve the savings. Programs like retrofit on resale or anytime there's a change of customer would be a trigger point for us to work with the customer to ensure they're meeting the fixture requirements or any other landscape requirements that are currently in place. And we recognize that all of these would certainly have an impact on the community, not only on our landscapes, but also our non-residential and our residential sector. Next slide. Looking at the similar table that Armin discussed for all the other project scenarios or potential projects, we have the savings or the demand reduction for each of both the conservation project and the regulatory driven project, and then also the cost range. I want to mention that these savings, of course, are out to 2040, a snapshot in the year 2045, and that we have hired Madaus Water Management to review both of these conservation scenarios to provide input and insight on if there's, something that we're missing, or if there's another subset of these types of projects that we should have within our scenarios that we should be considering as well. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Armin.
Okay, great. Thanks, Carrie. And Paul, I believe this is our pause.
Yeah, Armin, I think there's a lot of information that we've sort of put out there. Just maybe it would be good for us to take a pause and see if the folks attending have any questions on the water management alternatives that we've just run through.
Yes, we do. We have a few raised hands that keep coming. The first two are Maria G, then Michael Colette. So go ahead, Maria G.
Hello, thank you for taking my comments. Thank you for the meeting as well. I've brought up in a few of the other meetings water quality concerns with increasing the capacity of the Sula-Hula Reservoir and the likelihood of inundating additional known mines and tailings that everybody's aware of. In the last meeting, it didn't seem like that was a very big concern for the board. I reached out to the Regional Water Quality Control Board, and they provided me with many documents, and it appears that the mercury levels in the Sula-Hula have been analyzed and talked about for many years now. And so I guess my question is, what has it been implemented currently to address those concerns at the level it is? And if those water levels are elevated to the amount that you would like, what would have to be implemented to bring those mercury levels to not be a concern? Because in one email, it was even considered an issue. So I don't know at what level that concern is, and I'd like you to kind of elaborate on that for me? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Maria. Just briefly, so we do annual testing for metals in all of our reservoirs, and mercury is essentially non-detect in the water as far as drinking water is concerned. The regional board, of course, are concerned with bioaccumulation in fish and species that are confined and live in the reservoir. So from a drinking water perspective, it's really not a concern.
Thanks, Paul. Michael Colette, please.
Yeah, hi. I have two kind of dollars and cents questions. The first is when we look at your tables showing capital costs and then annual costs per acre foot, are the amortized costs associated with the capital investment included in the annual fees per acre foot? So it's just kind of wondering how those two numbers go together. And related is in your planning framework, which by the way, I mean, it's been fantastic. I've been watching all of this as an interested ratepayer for a long time. And I think it's been a really interesting process and well executed. But I don't see any spot where we pull up and we say, hey, what's our financing capacity? I mean, a lot of these projects are pretty darned expensive, and there must be some kind of ordinary limit or range of spend that we can actually reasonably entertain as we look at all these options. It doesn't seem to be like we have infinite financing capability. So both questions basically about the money side of this.
Armin, you want to take
I
the
can
first
take the
part?
first one, and maybe I'll leave it for you for the second one, Paul. Yeah, great question. Thanks for your comment there. And on each of those tables where we have capital costs and we have O&M costs, so all of the capital costs have been amortized and they're brought to an annualized present value, which are added then to the O&M costs. So when we look at the dollars per acre foot in that last column, they're combined capital plus O&M built into that number.
Yeah, in terms of financing, Paul, I'll give
Yep.
this one a shot. I'd say the question is the affordability of water for the community and how to think about it generally. From a financing standpoint, you know, over time, you increase rates to be able to pay for debt service of a large capital project is kind of the theory of how this would work. So it gets to the rate increase that would be needed. And sure, a $400 or $500 million project is very high for a community with this size rate base. And it would significantly increase those costs. The cost of water that we pass on. At this point, the cost is one factor of many to consider as we develop a roadmap. As we move into the roadmap, really, as Paul described early on, all these next steps is where we hone in on financing and what the impact will be to the community. We're going to bring certainly some of this as we further brief the board and move to a roadmap in terms of what's the economic impact. But at the end of the day, the question, and it's a very difficult one, of how much is too expensive for water, or what's the right price for water. And we do, like all water agencies, have infrastructure that needs attention. We have inflationary pressures on us, all kinds of stuff. So
Yeah.
this does need to fit into the big picture, and it will as we move this program forward.
I appreciate the enormous complexity, but I had no idea before watching you guys kind of do this. It does seem like the easiest answers are ones that tie us to the same sort of rainfall here that we might see in Sonoma. And so it feels like one of the interesting trade-offs is between highly resilient options like interties or more resilient options like interties versus perhaps less expensive options, but which don't have kind of that risk diversification value.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank
just
you,
a
Mr.
comment.
Right, and as we talk about these options more, we need to collectively, not just the project team, but the community, understand those trade-offs. And I do agree with you to a large extent. What this exercise is, it's a risk-based exercise. What amount of risk do we want to maintain, and what amount of risk do we want to address? And then that gets into really the modeling that was done in kind of the probabilistic look, meaning what's the frequency of the drought that we want to manage. And we did develop a very robust kind of design drought that's never occurred here in our recorded history. We looked at the drought, 2-year drought we just got out of, and assumed on the heels of that would be followed by the record drought of the 90s. So 2 worst droughts we've ever experienced back to back, a very low kind of probability. But anyway, that's where we are in terms of, and I think the question and the commenter, you're right on, because it's really a balance and looking at the trade-offs.
The next 3 speakers, Ed Jamison, phone caller 4065, and Phil Sauter. Go ahead, Mr. Jamison.
Yeah, thank you. This is yet again a really outstanding presentation. So first of all, thank you to all of you. I'd like to start with a couple of observations. On the cost of Sonoma water, I believe we paid about $1,360 per acre foot last year, and likely incurred another $200 to $300 of transmission costs, for a total cost of about $1,600 per acre foot, not the $1,300 shown on tonight's slide number 12. As for a brackish desal facility on the Petaluma River, Jacobs has indicated that 6 months of brine may have to be stored for release during the winter. I believe Sonoma would have to first call on any such potential desal capacity, perhaps 20 to 30 MGD for their own potential use. After Sonoma's needs, they might consider potential needs of 50 MGD for us and 5 MGD for North Marin, for a total of 40 to 50 MGD. This could require about 80 to 90 MGD of brine to be disposed of during drought-depleted winter flows on the Petaluma River. This all sounds questionable to me. On local desal, the seemingly excessive cost estimate for a 5 MGD desal plant on Pelican Way, starting at 357 million, then 302 million, and now still about 250 million, needs to be explained with numbers, not just round words. In a future presentation, please lay out the factors explaining why your estimates are twice that of 20% larger Antioch and of Nahanni, and also twice what was just last fall estimated on Pelican Way by Kennedy Jenks, I believe in conjunction with Jacobs, excluding a 30% contingency. Now a question. A couple of months ago, the Jacobs team stated that desal can be shut down for 2 days to a week, but that does not tell us how low a percentage of capacity it can be operated at on an ongoing basis. A key evaluation question. Can desal be run at 15% of capacity or 30%? We need to be provided the answer to this important question. Thank you again for your attention and for all the excellent efforts so far.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I might have to get back to you on the desal questions. Jim Logier, who's been developing our desalination, is not on the call today, so I don't have that detailed question on what is the percentage of capacity that could be run in a during an outage period. I'll have to say we'll get back to you on that one.
Well, I wanted to speak to the Petaluma concept, because it is just a concept at this point. It's very interesting in that it is not too salty, which greatly decreases the cost. And it's never been looked at seriously. There are questions in terms of the yield of putting in wells and how much water you'd get given the nature of kind of the substrate you'd be working in, which is kind of a lot of silt and fines that make it somewhat difficult, but we have to look into that. And we'd also have to look into the brine discharge, and there may be prohibitions and what would storage cost. At the end of the day, these storage numbers, I kind of agree with the numbers I just heard from the speaker. I think there's a lot of options in all these, but once we start looking into it, is there a partnership with 2 or 3 entities that are going to develop that project, and what would that look like? And, you know, it's hard at this point, given the kind of conceptual nature of that idea, to speak clearer about it. I do think the shifting of the costs for the other desal projects it can be looked at multiple ways. I choose to look at it that the team has heard the comments, has sharpened their pencils, and the numbers have changed as they've stated out of the gate that they were likely to change. So I appreciate the comments that have come in on that. And I do think the shifting in the numbers are attributed, in my view anyway, to some extent of the comments that have come in. I do think at this point, the numbers are fairly, are pretty good. But I do agree with the commenter that kind of pulling back the curtain on some of these assumptions and analysis. And in fact, that's exactly what's going on now. As we speak, these current few weeks this month, Jacob's team is pulling together a draft report that will include all or as much of the details as we can get in there. So everyone that's interested will be able to understand what the assumptions are, what the calculations were, and the basis for what has been presented and what will be presented. And we are, the goal is, the intention is, the intention is to have that report publicly available before we move into the next phase of looking at scenarios to develop the roadmap for everyone's benefit, certainly the public, the board, and staff, to have everything in the same place and let everyone look at it. So that is the direction we're going.
Ben, I guess I would just add a couple quick comments. And Armin, maybe you can refresh my memory, but I think the team were recently looking at desal project costs up and down California in terms of the cost of water. Because at the end of the day, the important number for us that we're looking at is the cost per acre foot. And as I understand it, the cost per acre foot that we've developed for the various desal options are in line with what the team is seeing in terms of the cost of water for California desal plants that currently exist. Is that right?
Yeah, that is right. There are some anomalies out there, but there, for example, the Carlsbad desal plant in San Diego is in fiscal year 2023, including all the increase in cost is roughly $3,000 an acre foot. A little over $3,000 an acre foot is what San Diego County Water Authority will be paying per acre foot of desalination supply.
Yeah,
we've looked at some of the other facilities. Of course, all of the costs are slightly different, and the methods for them developing costs are different. But we've gone through our numbers about 3 or 4 times. Are pretty comfortable where we're at. We're looking forward to documenting that and doing the final review, and then, as Ben said, getting those documents out for the public to review.
Yeah. So again, we do, you know, even the comments, we hear them, may not appear that we're doing anything in particular with them, but we really do hear them. And, you know, the project team has continued to look at these costs with respect to desal, even as recently as this past week. And then Mr. Jameson had a question on the cost of Sonoma Water. I was just able to find the cost for the next fiscal year. So the one that we're in, 22-23, the cost is about $1,308 per acre foot that we pay Sonoma. And he's correct, of course, that there would be additional costs for us to pump and add some chemicals to that water.
Thank you. Thank you all for our callers. We have a lot more to go. Number 4065, if you can please leave your comment.
Hi guys, it's Paul Mann with Water Champions. Thanks for taking my call. Apologies, I haven't been on the last few calls. but I do want to lend a perspective that I don't think I've heard tonight. The solutions that you're considering for our water future, whether it be desal or expanding the reservoirs or creating a recycled pipeline, we know they can each have their own detrimental climate impacts as they consume large amounts of electricity, they produce excessive heat, and they require a lot of expensive infrastructure to treat and dispose of that water that flows to and from each household. So we know that we need to increase water supply, for which some of your proposed solutions must be enacted. But please, I really want to ask that we not solely rely on these age-old solutions because they do impact our land, our wildlife, and our pocketbooks. And alongside your water supply solutions, we need to reduce demand so that supply requirements are less detrimental to our climate and to our environment. So your historical form of reduction is really by imposing irrigation restrictions and penalties when the water levels run low, but that actually threatens the health of plants. It makes our customers' landscapes dry, and it's more vulnerable to fire. That's a big issue here in Marin. So an easy and more climate-friendly solution that we have readily available today that I'd really like you to rethink is reducing water demand and keeping the landscapes green through water capture, reuse, and conservation systems. And I know that Carrie presented some numbers on these that were not too good, but we need a better effort. Australia had the millennium drought in 2000. Today, over half of Australia has been set up with water capture and reuse systems. And these systems turn each home into a local watershed that has a healthy ecosystem function because it captures and reuses water and it reduces municipal water consumption by 50% or more. So that's the number we're looking for, but we need to invest more. And it's very simple. By the design, homes locally harvest rainwater from the rooftops and the gray water from their showers, their bathtubs, their bathroom sinks, and their washing machines. And that's for direct use and irrigation on each property where the water was captured. Furthermore, we now have innovative home water recycling systems from overseas that now enable us to affordably convert that gray water into germ-free recycled water that can be used to flush toilets, do laundry, and store excess water in rainwater tanks for use in irrigation. That makes up 80% of our water use, so potable water use. So that's a huge reduction. And if we look at permaculture designs that can be made to rescope the landscape, such as using swales and rain gardens to capture the water, you can store and distribute that water over many months to the landscape. And lastly, you've already started this, but water conservation fixtures inside the home and drought-tolerant plants outside reduce that total volume of water being used. So let me just sum up here. We need your leadership to better diversify the water portfolio. You need to invest more, earmark more money like Australia did to educate the public about home water capture, reuse, and conservation. Create policies and incentives and help people to afford these things that Carrie says are too expensive. We also need you to provide more meaningful rebates and incentives that reward those who are using these solutions to reduce their water footprint for our collective sustainability. So we want to give them a carrot for doing something well. And by the way, as a reminder, our neighbors in Sonoma County are doing this. They're now providing up to a $5,000 rebate on rainwater tanks, plus free design services, which are worth about $2,000. That's pretty close to an EV tax credit. So please provide these incentives to support these solutions to reduce Marin's water consumption demand level, to more realistically keep it in check with its supply, so that we can have long-term water sustainability, so we can keep our landscapes green and we can reduce that risk of fire and the impact of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Mr. Phil Sauter. Then after Mr. Phil Sauter, we have Director Schmidt, Al Grumet, and David Bihar. So go ahead, Mr. Sauter.
Thank you, and a big thumbs up to the previous speaker. I'd also like to mention that I think North Marin Water, they all have smart meters, so they know by the day and by the hour how much water they're using, which is really, I think, necessary if you're going to change your behavior. I'd like to comment on three of the items. One I haven't heard talk too much about tonight, and that is reclaiming capacity from our existing reservoirs. As I understand it, we have 80,000 acre feet, but we can't get to about 30,000 of it. It's too murky. And it seems if we do nothing, we're going to continue to lose capacity. Rough numbers, it seems like maybe by 2040, if we keep doing what we're doing, we'll have lost half of our storage capacity. So it seems to me like low impact dredging might be something that we look at, and we do it year round. Maybe the district owns its own equipment. The numbers I ran on an envelope, if we were to continue to lose 1% of capacity a year, and we were able to reclaim 2%, that's about 800 acre feet annually net. We could recover lost capacity in about 30 years. Perhaps we could look at low impact dredging for 6 to 8 months a year. And I figured that maybe 200 acre feet a month for eight months would do the trick. It would take a long time, but it would be low impact, and we would reclaim that capacity, which we're going to have to do sometime. Second issue is on new reservoir capacity. It seems like raising the spillways is a quick and easy thing to do. But even there, I think we run the risk of unintended consequences. If I recall, when we raised Peters Dam in 1982, it was supposed to add 16,000 acre feet of storage to Kent Lake. But then the State Water Board came in and said, now you got to release 11,000 acre feet a year of environmental releases. So we paid for the whole enchilada, but we didn't get all of it because of the State Water Board coming in. We have a venue. I think, I know we don't want to go to the State Water Board at this point and run these by them, but we do have the Lagunitas Creek Technical Advisory Committee that meets 4 times a year. And there are people from the State Water Board on there. So that would be kind of a low profile way to get some of those thoughts in front of the State Water Board before we run into a nasty surprise. And then finally on conservation, that's sort of been the redheaded stepchild, and it's the only water supply alternative where we're looking 20 years out to get a meaningful contribution. I personally believe, and I'm willing to be proved wrong, that a worthwhile objective would be to move that 4 million gallon daily savings forward to 2025. Not that I believe conservation is the only option we'll need, but it could be a valuable adjunct to all the other options. It could give us more time, make us less reliant on expensive or a highly impactful alternative. And it could give us some breathing room in case that 4-year drought comes along quicker than we think. I'm grateful that we've got an environmental consultant working with us. I'm sorry that they're not here tonight. They have no opportunity to hear from the public, and we have no opportunity to make any comments or provide any input. They'll be working for several months with no public interaction, and that's likely to make their work product, which we're paying for, much less useful than it could be. Therefore, I'd like to ask staff to schedule an additional water supply workshop focused solely on conservation, and I'd like to do that within the next couple of weeks. Thank you.
I wanted to respond to a couple of those. Instead of shoehorning that conversation tonight, we're planning on that conversation being this third-party review of our conservation plan in context of the water supply assessment. This is the second third-party review that we will have done. And we're scheduling that discussion, is currently planned to bring it to the public for a full discussion November 16th during our Comms and Conservation Committee meeting on that day. So there definitely will be adequate, I imagine, discussion and understanding of what, if any, they found, what it looks like, and how it possibly would change things in context of what we brought forward. I did want to say the approach of developing what Carrie presented was to look for any and all opportunities that we could find from reducing demand in context of a water supply planning effort. And then, we costed it out like all the other options. So we pursued it in a similar fashion to desal, to Sonoma, where we looked at how much water could we find, and then we costed that out. And the first third-party reviewer thought we hit the mark. We'll see what this one When I say we, it's staff. We're fortunate to have really strong, experienced conservation staff here. But it'll be very interesting to all of us what the second third-party reviewer finds. So if you mark your calendar for November 16th, I think that would be great. I also just briefly wanted to mention that we are not losing storage. The 30,000 acre feet mark was designed to kind of work your way up. And what I mean by that, we do believe 4,000, maybe 5,000 acre feet that just would not be accessible, right? We'd have the bottom of these lakes with pockets of water and not really a way to access that water. 10,000 acre feet, we've never gone to that level, and we wouldn't want to from a water quality standpoint because it would introduce uncertainties. 30,000 is a number that was developed in recognition that other things can happen. We could be in a drought and have a seismic event or some other emergency or have operational issues. You don't want to plan to use up all your storage and what we could lose a connection to Sonoma. So it's designed so we are not planning for exhaustion essentially of our local storage. That wouldn't be prudent. So that's where that number came from. What we've done surveys a few years ago in the reservoirs, and Paul would know the number, I think, but maybe it's a 1% difference that we find now in terms of our storage versus what it was when the reservoirs were first built. So what we're fortunate in the watershed that it's a very thriving watershed, meaning we don't have the sort of activities up there that really can impact a reservoir, like construction activities, right? You see bales put around construction in urban areas, and that's to prevent siltation of your reservoir, which fortunately we don't get in a very pronounced way due to the nature of our watershed. But Paul, I don't know if you have at the tip of your fingers what that change was in our storage when we did the bathymetric measurements. I believe that's what we did.
We did do bathymetry. I don't have the exact percentage, but Lucy might. I know she's on this evening. I know a couple of the reservoirs, had maybe more storage capacity. For example, I think Kent was one of those that had more storage capacity. And others, maybe Nicasio, lost a little storage capacity, but net overall, it was in the very low percentile. Do you know, Lucy, off the top of your head?
Off the top of my head, it was about 1,500 acre feet overall for the total reservoir system.
So that's 2% roughly. So 2% over what time? And I assume we're going back to when the reservoirs were first built.
Yeah.
It's a pretty slow rate of deposition. Fortunately, we're very fortunate in this community.
Okay, back to our 11 speakers. Director Monty Schmidt, then Al Grumet. Go ahead, Director Schmidt.
Good evening, folks. Let me just start by really recognizing the really impressive and thoughtful questions that are coming from our community that are engaging. This is complex stuff, and it's just been really inspiring to hear the questions that folks are asking and really tearing into the information and really asking about assumptions and the background of all the alternatives. It's very impressive, and it's important because this stuff really is complex, and it is about our water future. So it's worth digging into and taking the time. I want to focus on two different things here. One is, I know that a lot of the discussion we've had so far have been about costs per acre foot, because it's we're fundamentally asking ourselves what are the most cost-effective alternatives. We're going to talk about the evaluation later in this presentation, which is of the alternatives, because feasibility is really an important thing. Resilience against climate change and drought these are important factors that can't be looked at, or we can't go just past and only focus only on the numbers. To that end, I want to recognize that one of the things that we do need to do, and we've talked about, I think, in the past, is the cost of raising existing surface storage and the cost upon that we might need to consider with acquiring land, and the costs and impact to people who live around those water bodies and have properties and facilities and whatnot. Those are really could be, I think, very, very substantial costs, and we really do need to at least have some sort of a ballpark estimate, because I think they're too large to overlook. There's other impacts and concerns and issues around that, but just in terms of the cost side of things, I want to see if we can't get that included in some way. I want to also highlight on the conservation costs. I think that when we look at the costs that we add to the district of doing things, I also wonder if we are able to produce the water that is needed for our community at a less of a volume, whether we have district savings that are factored into our costs, basically avoided costs. And when we also look at costs to our consumers, which is an important factor, whether we're also factoring in savings. If you're consuming less water to irrigate a lawn that's now a nice drought resilient garden, are we seeing that as a cost savings and factoring that also into our cost per acre foot, or our cost to our consumer at least? Because I think it's a really important factor that we should get in there as well. The last thing I want to also touch on, though, is this concept of a regulatory approach to conservation. I think that is a really negative framing and is not really the way I would look at it. I think that there's a lot of best management practices that are being promoted to ensure that communities throughout the country and frankly the world have safe and reliable water. So I don't think of it as a regulatory approach. I think of it as these are cost-effective measures potentially for meeting societal needs and having other benefits. So I think the regulatory approach is kind of a wrong framing, and kind of commensurate with that is the notion of a expensive enforcement effort. I'd rather see, rather than considering an enforcement effort, I would think of maybe as an outreach and education, which I know is part of what I think, Carrie, which you are thinking about too. But again, the framing of an enforcement effort is maybe just the wrong approach. I think is a wrong approach. We aren't draconianly enforcing what we're requiring or asking of our community now. And I think focusing on education is probably I think a overall more effective way to engage our customers. Lastly, I just want to say, I know there are some questions about being able to see the review from the Dows on conservation. I think that's an important one. I know that this is going to be brought up at the comms meeting, as Ben mentioned, but I don't think that that's very easily accessible for a lot of folks. So I'd like to see if we can't bring the results to that to one of our board meetings at night as well, so that folks who can't make a morning meeting are able to see that and engage with that discussion at one of our nighttime board meetings.
Thank you. Mr. Al Grumet and then Alan Edmondson. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I'm relatively new to this and am impressed by the thoughtful approach and the detailed analysis that I've seen in the presentation today. One of the questions that I had is whether, if we're looking at this as a cost-based analysis, when we look at environmental impacts of the various alternatives, has there been an attempt to quantify the ancillary environmental impacts of each of the proposed solutions, so that rather than viewing impacts from, say, pollution and emissions that contribute to climate change as external to the cost structure here, we might have an additional lens into this process where we can see a fully loaded cost, understanding that, things like pollution might not be borne directly by all members of the community. It would be an additional useful perspective on each of the solutions to see what incremental costs are being created in communities near to home and far-flung communities. Sometimes when you're dealing with these pollution impacts, they can actually dramatically skew the cost analysis. And so the request is not to, be very formal about how one goes about that and trying to quantify each and every environmental impact, but maybe doing a rough back of the envelope calculation so that you can just see if there are certain alternatives in the portfolio that are being considered that wind up looking a little uglier or a little prettier when these external costs are internalized. Because I think sometimes when we don't do that, our decisions, when they're strictly cost-based and ignore meaningful costs, can lead to a bit of distortion in the process. And my sense is that things like conservation and many of the comments that you've heard tonight will look meaningfully more attractive if the costs associated with many of the other alternatives are not viewed as external to the process. So I'd appreciate seeing that as part of the environmental sessions to come. And I think it would be a useful thing for the board to consider as it's looking at constructing the optimal portfolio. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, just comment. I appreciate the speaker's comment there and question, and I think we paused the discussion kind of halfway through, so we've shown the supply, the potential yield, and the cost aspects, and where we're heading in the next portion is really about additional evaluation criteria, and then we have looked at environmental impacts, legal, jurisdictional issues as well. So those are kind of forthcoming. They're not quantified in terms of a dollar cost, but they are characterized in terms of kind of high, medium, and low impact. So we do have different lenses on the alternatives than just a cost for implementation. I thank you for your comment.
Thank you. Alan Edmondson, Andrea, then Barbara Reedy. Go ahead, Mr. Edmondson.
Hello. I have questions on two topics. Are most of the operating costs of indirect and direct potable water, are they like electricity or power costs? And if so, could Marin Municipal Water District build renewable power supplies to offset those costs? And my second topic is how you're planning for the large number of new housing units that are required to be built in Marin County. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think I can take the first one, maybe Carrie or Paul take the second one. Yeah, in terms of the reuse alternatives and the indirect potable reuse, indirect potable reuse, yes, a large portion of that cost, in particular the O&M cost, is dominated by energy use and electrical power. I'll leave it to the district to respond on in terms of looking forward in terms of power, but it is a large portion of the annual cost is associated with the operation and the pumping and treatment of that water.
Yeah, and I guess just to touch on the renewable aspect of power, of course, our power currently is from Marin Clean Energy. So, and we purchased their deep green power. So I think it would be technically possible for us to build renewable, power for each project. That would, of course, greatly increase the cost of each of the projects and the unit costs of water. In terms of planning in this effort, in the strategic water supply assessment, we have folded in the regional housing needs assessment into our planning horizon and numbers. So the demands that you saw Carrie talking about on the conservation slide, those all include the full allotment as if all of those housing units were going to be built in Marin. So we have factored that in.
Thank you, Paul. Andrea, please, then Barbara Reedy.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for taking this time to measure all these numbers out. It must have been brutal, and I don't envy you in the least because I'm a landscaper and I come from a whole systems approach. And I want to echo some of the points that Paul Mann made, calling into this whole problem of ecosystem restoration, the larger ecosystem. We would really like to consider larger ecosystems when we're thinking about integrated systems. So trying to capture water on the land that we're trying to rehydrate is a really important perspective. We can use recapturing technology with permaculture, with indigenous wisdom, with various porous materials when we're doing landscape driveways, all of that. Swaling, water catchment systems, trees, increasing the soil sponge of the landscape is a tried and true mechanism for increasing water held underneath the soil and increasing porosity. We also have to remember the water cycle. The water cycle needs water to bring water. It is a magnetic and a chemical relationship. The more we manage to hold and store underground, the more we can capture from the clouds when they do build up. So these are perspectives that I really want to encourage you guys to consider while you're doing all your numbers. What are you doing to increase the porosity, the catchment systems on the huge amount of acreage that we have, including composting? So adding porosity through the mechanism of soil, someone's got to say it, mycorrhizal fungi. It has not been brought up, but we really need to look at that. And we also need to include the voice of the beaver as a way of holding water on the land. So I know I'm way outside the field on these perspectives, but I would love to hear you guys consider them and start including them in the thinking that goes into managing a huge watershed such as we have. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea.
I'll just touch on that briefly, if I may, Andrea. No, I appreciate your comments. So we have rebates currently available, both gray water and rainwater. We promote watershed approach to landscaping, which is a whole watershed, sustainable landscape practices readily. And our challenge is uptake, right? And so, when we factored in these projections looking forward, we did incorporate rainwater capture. I think it's 15,000 gallons a year, which is not much, but it's more than we've seen, in recent years prior to the drought. So anything we can all work together on to really promote these programs and increase uptake, I'm game. You can reach out to me. I'd love to have a conversation.
And just to build on that, Carrie, briefly, the strategic water supply assessment is, we're looking at a very high level of confidence in achieving what we've set out in terms of the conservation project. It doesn't mean that that's where the district is going to stop in terms of our aspirations for conservation and the conservation program. And so we have separately, right, started looking at ways to break down those barriers to uptake for both, rainwater capture and gray water. And we'll be bringing some changes to the gray water process and ultimately to the code to the board in the near future. So we are working on things outside of just the strategic water supply assessment. Terry, how are we on questions and hands at this point?
We have 8 more hands.
Okay, maybe we'll see if we can get through a few more, but we do have a second half of the presentation that we'd like to lay out for you tonight and encourage further questions. So let's see if we can get through a few, Terry.
Okay, Barbara Reedy, Larry Minikes, and Marilyn Price. Go ahead, Miss Reedy.
I'll be happy to know. I just have one question and no particular statements. If this is regarding the spillway gate project, if the spillway gate levels are raised, I'm curious what, if any, would be the increase to the floodplain levels for the reservoirs that it's under consideration for? and whether or not, if there is a change to the floodplains, if you've done any modeling about that. Thanks.
I think Marcella, you can confirm if I get it wrong, but I think no, there is no change to the floodplain for the reservoirs with increasing the spillways.
That's correct, Paul, because it's within the current dam elevation.
Yeah.
For the gates, yeah.
Thank you. Larry Minikis, please, and then Marilyn Price.
Good evening, and again, thank you for a great presentation that's still ongoing, and I'll try to be brief because I know we still have a bit more to go. This is in regard to AMI, which is a little bit of a stepchild during the process because it's almost in parallel with the work that the team is doing here, in that on May 20th, we received an AMI implementation plan update. And it appears that, yes, we're moving towards AMI. So should we bake that into the work we're doing here? For example, in conservation, we're trying to get to 106 gallons per person by 2045, or 73 for residential per person per day. That represents a 14.5% decrease in current use. And in one of your slides on the 20th, the American Water Works Association claims that they are seeing on average a 6 to 12% decrease in water use with the implementation of AMI. So my question is, if that's the case, we can almost be halfway there with the implementation of AMI in terms of conservation, even at the low end. Should this be baked into this process at this point? And I'll mention one other thing that I brought up at the meeting, the most recent meeting, where we talked about Purple Pipe going to Peacock Gap and the expense and tearing everything apart. And my comment at the time was, well, has anyone thought about building a small desalination plant? When you look at Peacock Gap and San Quentin together, the numbers come into about 440 acre feet at a cost of between $35 and $45 million estimated. Would it at any point make sense to cite a small desal plant for these two with a special assessment charged to these two large water users? It's just a question. I don't know if it is even financially feasible, if it makes sense. I'm not a great desal proponent, but it's one of those things that perhaps should be thought about. And that's it for right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Marilyn Price, please.
Yes, hi, and thank you for everything you're doing. And I know it's a lot of time, a lot of energy, and for that, a big thanks. I actually come onto this subject in a little bit different viewpoint because I am an ardent conservationist, living a minimalist lifestyle, and I read a lot about what is happening to this world, what's going to be happening in the years to come. And I feel we all really need to live differently. We need to live within our means. We need to be able to live with what water we can generate here in Marin without altering this and that. Every time we alter, we seem to cause more harm because we're trying to live the lifestyle that we just can't live anymore. And I think we really need, if any funds are spent, should be spent on conservation. What would it cost to, I listened to Paul Mann, what would it cost for the water district to to help pay for everybody to have a gray water system and rain barrels, give people rain barrels, and then spend a lot of money on education so that we try, first and foremost, every single conservation tool that we have available before we go to these other alternatives. So again, that's my way of thinking, and I just wanted to let you know where I'm coming from. And there are probably a lot more people out there that feel the way I do too. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Price. We do have 4 more speakers, Paul. Do you want me to go ahead and go with that, or?
Yeah, let's let's see if we can get through those and then we'll
All right.
move on.
Great. Okay. We have Christy, DC, Elaine Dulcini, Moeller, and Director Bragman, please. Go ahead, Christy.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I also just have a quick question, maybe. I just would like a better explanation of how we can rely on Sonoma water or other areas' water when everyone will be facing the drought at the same time. And, you know, just for example, Sonoma is already facing its increasing demands and needs and the challenges that go along with that, and they have a lower supply. So just a better explanation on how all this can work when anybody we're partnering with is also experiencing it. And then the only positive hope about brine is, wouldn't it be cool if they could really turn brine into batteries? That's it. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, Elaine.
Go ahead.
No, you go ahead, Ben, if you.
Yeah, I was just gonna touch on Sonoma. It's really a good question to understand that concept. And the concept is taking winter water. And what we mean by that, it's water that's going down the Russian River out to the ocean, and it's not being tapped for beneficial uses. And the flow is far, far greater than what's been determined to be the minimum stream flows, meaning the flows necessary for the environment, the fish, the overall ecosystem of the Russian River. So we're talking about ideas to pull more of this water. Yes, it's generally a similar climate, and that is on the kind of downside of the Sonoma concept. Yet with the understanding that if we think about atmospheric rivers that we know bring a huge percent of our precipitation, we need them to hit the mountain. And many, many of these storms every year go north and miss us. But the watershed for the Russian River is, Paul, if we count that out 50 times, I don't want to make up a number and I'm doing it now, but it's far greater than the size of our watershed. Do we have?
So the Russian River watershed is 1,485 square miles. I should have ours on the tip of my tongue. I don't know if anybody has it. I think we do ours in acres.
You're doing the math real time.
Yeah, trying to do it real time, but it's you know, on the order of I think 50 square miles comparatively. So it's sorry, here it is, 104. Well, we serve the entire area we serve is 147 square miles. So that would be a factor of 10, but the watershed is smaller than that. So
much smaller.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's probably on the 30 or something. But anyway, a huge multiplier essentially of the target area that an atmospheric river needs to hit would be one of the significant benefits. And it's why we see flows coming out of the Russian River going in the Pacific Ocean, even at times where we aren't getting the precipitation. So there's more that we need to explain about this. But I think that's the essence of the concept.
Yeah, turns out it's about 34 square miles, Ben. So it's 42 times smaller than the Russian River.
Okay, great. We have 3 more, Elaine Dulcini, Moeller, and then Director Larry Bragman. Go ahead, Ms. Dulcini.
Thank you so much for your hard work. And I can just say that I'm totally impressed with that data that I've received and the depth of the reporting from all the, I mean, it's kept me busy trying to understand more and more about the work that you do. And so I definitely just appreciate all your work. And a thought that I have is in regards to Silihuly is it seems like Silihuly is being looked at for a couple of things. One of them is like, you know, to increase the capacity for rainfall and capture. and also for storage for the winter waters. And so my point is more about the storage, using it as storage. And I thought, has the district thoroughly looked at utilizing Sule-Hule as it is? Because perhaps the district has, it already has the capacity that it needs. If they, in regards to the timing of moving the winter water, coinciding it with the patterns at low capacity at Sule-Hule, you'd be able, or in Nicasio, perhaps the district may already have the space without having to add the extra capacity. It just doesn't fill during the low water years, and it's already a site for storage capacity. From what my observations from driving by and seeing that and looking at the data, in lower water years, there's already capacity there. And then just a point, perhaps, that the mercury, although the mercury in Sule-Hule isn't a problem for drinking water, it does bioaccumulate in the fish, and it is causing problems with the environment. So that in terms of anything that's eating the fish, and I see the eagles and bald eagle, golden eagle, well, not so much golden eagle, but there are a lot of terns and pelicans and all kinds of fish-eating birds that are getting that. And people who fish there, I don't know, I don't see signs posted about that, but that there is a problem with bioaccumulation of mercury in Sule-Hule, and would hate to see it continue to be a even larger reservoir and having more of that. And my last point is, somebody talked about dredging. I think it would stir up that mercury in the sediments. Probably not a very good idea to dredge the Sule-Hule reservoir because of that problem. Anyway, appreciate your thoughts on them.
Yeah, we are looking at both increasing local storage as well as distinctly bringing water in for storage. If we think about during a drought, kind of by definition, reservoirs will be relatively low. So there is some capacity certainly to use it for storage. So that is one of the concepts in terms of getting winter water and storing it in Sule-Hule or Nicasio, in addition to potentially looking at the range of options to increase local storage. I did want to say, Ms. Dolcini, that even though staff is bringing the concept of Sule-Hule, the concerns of the landowners in the area is not going unnoticed. There are significant questions that the board has asked of staff in that regard. And there's a lot of concern on the extent of inundation that would be there, and the overall impacts to the rural part of Marin, West Marin. So I want to just note that those concerns and comments haven't gone into some sort of vacuum or something. They're being thought about. They're being quite a lot. I would say it certainly complicates significantly that project, and it's one of many, many considerations really well down the road of, is local storage, increasing local storage viable, and what concepts are most doable, not just from a financial standpoint, but all the considerations, inundation, environmental impacts, and the like. So we appreciate your active participation and comments. Thank you.
Moeller, and then Director Bragman, please.
Good evening. This is David Moeller in Larkspur, and I want to start by thanking you for your thoughtful work on this. I was very interested in the presentation of alternatives, but I couldn't help but note that the presentation focused almost exclusively on the yield and the cost of each alternative. And obviously, these are very important parameters in evaluating alternatives. But given our worsening climate crisis, there's an even more important consideration. It seems that even at this initial high-level analysis stage, the greenhouse gas emissions related to each alternative should be evaluated, listed, and considered as a high-level parameter in any kind of decision-making going forward. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Mr. Mueller, just respond to that. It's exactly where we're heading in the presentation. We are doing, for each of the alternatives, we're doing an assessment of the energy use, and associated with energy use, we're doing an assessment of the greenhouse gas emissions associated with each of the alternatives. So that is a factor that's being considered. We just haven't got there yet.
And Director Bragman, please.
Hi, you guys. Thank you for your work and thoroughness of the scope. Just a couple comments. First, on spillway gates, there was a question about getting a surprise from the State Water Board, and I think all staff and our consultants are aware that we would work in coordination with the State Water Board as we went through the further feasibility of either raising those spillways or putting in gates. And North Marin is actually in that process right now. So we do have a model and possibly something we can look at as we go forward, or if we decide to go forward with that option. The second regulatory question or concern I have is on IPR. We are, as a district, if we discharge or release treated water into the creeks, that's considered a violation of the State Water Code. And I'm just wondering how that would square with sending treated wastewater into our reservoirs, which I'm sure would have residual chlorine and chloramine in them. It just seems that would be a massive environmental impact. And then the last thing I wanted to suggest, and of course, I don't expect anyone to have the answer, is whether the district would consider doing a test well up in the Petaluma Aquifer to really sort of cut through the speculation and get some quantitative data about the availability of that brackish water aquifer. So thanks again. I just wanted to put my comments in, and I'm gonna sign off. I know it's getting late, so thank you.
There are no further comments at this time.
Okay. Armin, when you're ready.
Okay, great.
Paul, I just wanted to just touch on the last comment.
Yeah.
Just the test well. I think that's a really good example of the sort of work that would come as the roadmap is being implemented. So if the roadmap indicated to further explore the concept of the Petaluma River desal notion, likely along with other projects and elements, right? Not putting all our eggs in one basket as we progress into greater technical analysis in terms of feasibility, costs, and all the other considerations. Anyway, this would be a good project that I imagine we would move into in the roadmap if the Petaluma River was teed up in that way, which I wouldn't be surprised. Well, I don't know how the roadmap's going to look yet, but anyway, it's a good example of the sort of work, and each one of these water supply projects really has comparable work ahead of us, and that's one example. So Paul, well,
yeah.
Yep. Thanks.
Yeah, fully agree with that last statement there, Ben. Particularly for Petaluma, it's very conceptual in nature at this point. There's probably even before test well, there's more hydrogeological studies that could be done to characterize that a little bit better. So definitely more work to move forward with. Speaking of moving forward today, I wanted to talk about, we kind of stopped with the yield and the cost, and I noticed a number of the comments were about what are the other measures and how do we build those in, and that's exactly where we are heading here. We wanted to, we've articulated the yield and the cost aspects, but those are two components of a larger evaluation process. And so really the goal of the evaluation process from our standpoint is to look at, help us discern the differences between alternatives not necessarily that one is better or more negative, but look at the differences between them. To look at some of the positive and challenging characteristics associated with each of the alternatives. To start to look at synergies and challenges of the alternatives and the combination of those as we move into a strategy and a portfolio process where we might be combining a number of alternatives to seek a more desirable outcome. We've developed a set of criteria. So two, what we call a performance criteria, essentially how well does the option resolve the imbalances or the deficits that we see in the critical dry years. So how well can it reduce the shortage? How well can it retain storage above the target of 30,000 acre feet? Then we look at evaluation criteria. And so if you can think of them as if two options have similar levels of performance, how do we judge between those? We want to look at how do the individual alternatives perform, what combinations there are, and which portfolios might be the most strategic to suggest and recommend in the roadmap. So with that, we've developed a number of additional criteria. Yield and cost are the first two listed in this table. But you can see from the following rows, we've looked at timing. So how quickly could a project start producing the benefits that it's expected? So that looks at planning, design, permitting, and implementation. Many of the projects will have longer timeframes. Reliability. So one of the comments today about reliability, how will that water actually be there in the dry years? Flexibility. How could that particular option be turned on and off with relatively small implications? Environmental, we've gone through kind of a CEQA checklist of environmental considerations and have considered that in one of our criteria. Feasibility, largely looking at the technical feasibility of the concepts. Energy, like we were just talking with one of the questions about the greenhouse gas. So we've looked at the energy estimates. We're in the process right now of distilling that for all of the alternatives and then doing conversions to get from the energy to the greenhouse gas estimates. Permitting and legal, how complicated would they be? Social, kind of a broad assessment of positive or negative socioeconomic effects. The jurisdiction one I think is quite interesting in looking at kind of the primary jurisdiction for the implementation. Is it something that Marin can accomplish by the district themselves? Does it require state and federal parties? Does it involve dozens of parties up and down the state? So how complex is the jurisdiction for implementation? And then we've added a public acceptance criteria. For all of the criteria, we've put them into a qualitative scale at this point. They're in a 1 through 5 qualitative scale. And for some of them, we actually have quantitative information that we will put into our reports, but we put them in the qualitative scale in order to view them all side by side. Okay, so very briefly, I'll walk through kind of the high level setup of our evaluation. And this is a really high level summary. We'll have more details in the report as we're writing it currently. For the Sonoma Water Partnerships, I'll just set this one up so those listening can understand how the evaluation has been characterized. So we have each of the Sonoma Water Partnerships listed here. Some of them are built off of each other. So we have a code with them, the name of that particular alternative or sub-alternative. We have the location, general location on a map just for reference in the upper right. In the upper left plots each of the alternatives in terms of its cost in dollars per acre foot and the yield value in terms of acre feet per year of new yield. Essentially, just a graphical representation of the information we shared on the previous tables. Then we have each of the criteria listed as a column in this table. So we have yield and cost, timing, reliability, flexibility, and so on, moving all the way down. For each of the, within each of the criteria and for each of the alternatives, we've provided a 1 through 5 scale, and we've color coded that from green to red. So those that show up as the very dark greens here are performing best with respect to that particular rating. And those that are scaled to the to the reds are the ones that are performing less positive for that particular rating. So if I just take the first row as an example, this is looking at maximizing use of Sonoma water with existing facilities. So it's largely an operational change. It has kind of a middle modest yield. We've shared the yield information before. Has a low cost, could be implemented relatively quickly. So the timing rating is quite good. Reliability is kind of in the middle of the range because it is kind of dependent upon similar types of storms hitting both watersheds, even though the Russian River is quite a bit more robust. It's flexible. It has a high flexibility rating, high feasibility rating. You can turn it on or off. It's already being done, so it's about doing more of the same. And then you can see the rest of the ratings are similarly kind of the green colors. I'll just point out maybe one other one here. The one that's called SM3A, which is a dedicated conveyance from Stafford to Nicasio. It has a smaller yield rating, therefore it's a reddish color here. Can be implemented relatively quickly. It's a shorter amount of conveyance that would be required, and has a lot of the other positive attributes. So what we've done here is, so hopefully that was as clear as that can be in the short time frame here, and this again will be documented into our report that's forthcoming. But kind of summarizing these options in particular, we look at maximizing the use of Sonoma water is likely to be produced supply at additional supply, moderate supply at relatively low cost, has implementation that can be implemented very quickly, and highly flexible. Yield numbers are not the highest we'll find them. Getting these conveyance, the bottlenecks in conveyance can increase supply at kind of moderate cost. It was reliable at lower quantities in the drier years, has flexible operations and likely low environmental and permitting impacts. And then finally moving to kind of the little bit more complex dedicated conveyance. These are larger new conveyance pipelines that would take water directly to marine storage. They can increase yield at higher cost, will improve the reliability, primarily because of the yield that they could bring. So they can bring larger quantities of water during those wet periods, that winter water when it is available. Kind of modest environmental permitting and jurisdictional complexities with the new conveyance. So this is the kind of the setup for all of the alternatives that we've done. And for each of these, when we produce the report, we have a documentation of kind of how we arrived at the 1 through 5 rating associated with each one of these. Just to be clear, these are qualitative ratings. We tried to do our best to have a guide. We have a rating guide that we use as a team to assign the ratings, but they are qualitative, made based on our best judgment at this point.
And Armin, if I could, the design of this kind of criteria scoring is not intended to average the scores and the best score wins necessarily. We recognize that by definition, as you heard from Armin, some of the scoring is subjective, meaning there's not right and wrong in the scoring. And if we asked everyone on the call to do the scoring, we'd have, 50, 60, 70, however many people are on the call. we'd have that number of different, color codes, because everyone would come up with something a little different. The intent of this effort is to help in the decision-making, to help. So this is the team's best effort, and to show the community and the board, certainly, who will be making the ultimate decision, ways to look at different projects differently, and how some of the criteria, maybe environmental is weighed heavier by some or others, maybe cost is a driver for some and not others, right? So anyway, it's a tool. It's not deterministic, I guess, at the end of the day.
Yeah. Yeah, very good. Thanks for that, Ben. That's great comments. And that's exactly how we intend to use it. We're not looking to total up scores and do weighting based on preference sets. I'll move on to the next one to keep us going. The next group of options are their local storage augmentation, whether they're enlargement, new reservoirs, or spillway gates. You can see they start to kind of create little categorizations for themselves in the scoring. We've got augmentation. Much of the storage augmentation or the expansion of existing storage would produce new supply at moderate cost. Based on our assessments, would be reliable in most years. Certainly in the driest years, it would not be as reliable, but we're looking at how do you create storage entering into the dry years. Has kind of a lower energy and carbon footprint compared to other alternatives. And then kind of the moderate to high environmental or social impacts associated, depending on how a project would actually be implemented with existing landowners and potential new inundation areas. New storage is likely to produce lower yields at higher cost. We're finding these are actually quite a bit higher. The storage sites that we've looked at here have fairly high costs. The dam heights would be really, really large, and several of them in environmental would have significant environmental impacts and permitting challenges. The movable spillway gates generally have kind of lower to moderate yield, but also lower cost. They could be implemented earlier than the other projects. High flexibility by design, that they could be operated or not operated in any given year, and likely lower environmental and permitting challenges based on, just like the comments earlier, most of the movable spillway gates would be operating the reservoir in the storage levels that it's already been experienced. The water transfers with conveyance through bay interties. Again, we've looked at kind of 3 or 4 different types of interties. East Bay mud, Contra Costa, 2 versions of a North Bay aqueduct intertie, and then the San Francisco PVC intertie. Again, they are likely to provide kind of moderate additional supply. So I think the way we've described them at this point would be highly flexible. They're a temporary transfer program. The reliability has some questionable certainty in terms of who else might be in the market for purchasing those same supplies during a critical year. The Delta regulations, you're losing water as you move across the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. So anywhere from 20 to 35% of that water might be lost. And it has a little more complicated permitting and multiple jurisdictions involved, because we're looking at Sacramento Valley transfers. We're moving the water through non-municipal or Marin municipal systems before it arrives into Marin system. So a lot of dependence on third-party conveyance and treatment. And then significant new conveyance in order to deliver water from any of those areas into Marin system. The desalination set of projects, again, we have the Marin desal at 3 different sizes, 5, 10, and 15 MGD, million gallons per day facility sizes. Containerized facility, the Bay Area Regional concept, and then the Petaluma brackish concept. Most of the alternatives would produce high level of new supply. The costs are fairly high for desalination. It would have high reliability in that the source water is generally available all the time. The Petaluma brackish may be one exception to that, as if water levels are a concern in the basin. It has a lower level of flexibility in that lots of infrastructure is developed, would likely have to be operated in a more consistent basis than some of the other projects. High energy use and potential complexity on environmental impacts. The Petaluma brackish would produce kind of moderate supply at moderate cost. We think this could be implemented a little bit more quickly than the other desalination projects. The reliability, though, is not yet known, and I think that's really important, that this one is very much in conceptual in nature, and if the board chooses to move down a path to evaluate this one, there would be some immediate next steps to identify whether it truly can produce the yield that we're estimating. Lastly, the water reuse options. Just to summarize them, the recycled water projects, the Peacock Gap and San Quintin recycled water expansion projects, as we shown on the table, they're relatively low yield in terms of producing a new supply. Costs are fairly high. Reliability, though, is quite good and unlikely to have negative impacts in that it's an expansion of existing recycled water program. Kind of on the flip side, the IPR, the indirect potable use and direct potable use alternatives, they could produce a fairly high yield with high reliability in that wastewater is generally available, and the way we've constructed the alternatives, we've essentially set them up to operate with the minimum levels of wastewater flows. The costs are high, as high energy use and potential higher environmental challenges. With the direct potable use, there is a further challenge in that we have yet unestablished state regulations, and it would be kind of a first of a kind project in the state. And then I'll wrap up this portion with the water conservation. Again, the two programs that Carrie outlined earlier, the kind of water conservation and this more regulatory driven program, has early implementation for the first program. Again, highly flexible, positive environmental and energy and permitting, and could be fully within the jurisdiction of Marin. The larger program will have higher cost. It may be less reliable in that the uptake by citizens may be less so as we get deeper into the conservation level. And we've heard it could face some further public acceptance challenges, although I'm not, it's uncertain whether those could not be overcome based on some of the discussions today. So what we've done at this point is we've done that the evaluation for all of the alternatives that we've analyzed to date. And again, as Ben mentioned, we're not looking to find the best alternative, specific alternative. What we really are now moving towards is looking at how do we identify strategies. What we're thinking of as basically a particular plan of action or policy designed to achieve the water management goals. And in order to achieve those strategies, it's very likely that we're looking at combinations of alternatives or portfolios to implement that particular strategy. So for example, a strategy that maybe emphasizes a large infrastructure investment that might take 10 or more years to develop would likely have to be packaged with a water management alternative that can produce some amount of supply in the shorter time frame. So when we look at portfolios, we're looking at how do we combine the strengths of individual alternatives together. And that's really where we're at in the process right now. We're looking at how to kind of balance those longer and shorter term, where's the synergies between various alternatives, and then how do we get towards the setting up of those portfolios. And that part is underway at this point. We've not developed those portfolios yet or fully articulated the strategies, and we hope to be doing that in the next month as we move into the month of November. And with that, Paul, I'll let you wrap up, if you don't mind.
Okay, yeah, you're getting tired of talking, Armin.
Yeah.
Thanks for pulling us through all 40 or so slides. Yeah, very quickly, as we mentioned, Carrie mentioned at the review of the conservation program is, or excuse me, of the conservation as a water management alternative is being done by Medallis, and we're targeting November 16th. So mark your calendars for that review. And Armin talked about integration of the water management alternatives into the decision support model and how we can turn them on and off and see how they affect the potential deficits that we're seeing. And then we just went through creating strategies, portfolios that will ultimately end up as potentially roadmap strategies. And once we have a portfolio, we want to be able to evaluate the portfolios across all of the range of scenarios that Armin identified earlier. We're focusing quite a bit on scenario number 3, which is our drought scenario. And the reason for that is it presents the greatest deficits. But the other scenarios present different challenges. We want to make sure that whatever portfolios we've come up with understand how they're going to behave when we run them through those scenarios. We've also heard some comments this evening about the need to look at financial impacts, and while Armin and his team won't be delving deep into rate impacts, we are going to be able to take a look at we provided the costs for the project, cost per acre foot, and the district's team can start folding that into what that might look like in terms of potential for rate impacts. Our upcoming schedule is somewhat to be determined. We are in a moment where we're writing up the technical report, as Armin mentioned, and also putting together the strategies and portfolios. Ultimate goal is, of course, to have our roadmap in December, early January at the latest. And so that's where we are this evening. If you are, just a reminder, and you want to ask a question, you're on your smart device or your computer, raise hand feature in Zoom, or *9 if you're listening in from a phone. And that concludes our presentation. I think if there are any questions on that second half or leftover questions from the first half, we'd be happy to entertain them.
So Paul, I believe we have one public commenter right now, Kate Powers. So Ms. Powers, I'm going to enable your speaking permissions. And then after Ms. Powers, Jenna and Phil Sauter. Go ahead, Ms. Powers.
Thank you. Really appreciate all the work that's being done. And I just had one thought, and that is including in the alternatives analysis how an alternative would affect opportunities for other planning in some areas, especially I'm thinking of desal and the Petaluma brackish groundwater siting. There is a Petaluma Bayland strategy that Sonoma Land Trust and Sonoma Resource Conservation District are working on in terms of conservation planning and sea level rise opportunities for restoring marshes, et cetera. And so I think overall, including in the alternatives analysis, an analysis of any other planning efforts or projects that might be in process, how the alternatives might affect those would be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Jenna, please.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Thanks for putting this together. It's just interesting looking at the impacts of all these projects. I just want to echo what Paul Mann had to say, what Ms. Price had to say. that, you know, investing in water conservation and reuse is really something that seems like an afterthought versus what's on the table here. And the cost of these alternatives that you're presenting here tonight, I recognize the need for supply, but they're all very high, and it sounds like some could take over 10 years to implement. And I don't know that we have that long to really find these solutions. And if we wanted to really do something that has an immediate impact, I think putting an investment up front, providing rainwater tanks, gray water systems for every home, it would be cheaper and reduce potable water by 50% or more. And I'm just curious why this isn't being considered more deeply.
Yeah, it's a good question, and Carrie, you can fill in where I fall short. But in general, there doesn't seem to be any literature or evidence that we've seen around the uptake of rainwater to the level of 50% that's been suggested this evening. And so really we have these programs already. We're just not seeing the level of uptake. So I do appreciate the comments, and we are looking into what the potential barriers might be for uptake of rainwater and gray water in particular. So if you've got any studies or any information that would help us in that regard, we're interested. Carrie, I don't know if you have anything you'd like to add.
I think that's good.
Thank you. And Mr. Phil Sauter.
Yeah, am I unmuted?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask a couple of thought experiment questions of the folks here tonight. And the first one is, can you imagine looking back one day and wondering how we ever thought it was a good idea to sprinkle 4 million gallons of potable water on the ground every day? That's about what we use with single family residents for outdoor use. The other question I've been asking myself, can you foresee a potential drought scenario where we'd have to turn off all the outdoor spigots all at once? And I've actually lived through one of those, and have to do that without having helped our customers transition to drought tolerant landscapes. Regarding a conservation budget, how much would it be worth for Marin Water customers to be drought tolerant? And if you come up with an eye-popping number, would it help to know that once you've spent that money replacing a lawn this year, you're not going to have to spend it again next year? This morning, I was over the hill speaking with some folks, and I asked my regular question about whether they know how much water they're using. And I also told some folks about the Flume device. During this presentation tonight, one of my pals emailed me and said he just got his water bill today, and he used 109 gallons a day versus 129 last year. So kudos to him. He also asked me for a link with the Flume device, which I sent him. So we sold one of those during this call tonight. And then finally, I'd like to observe that at least half the public comments and questions tonight had to do with conservation. It makes me think that another evening public meeting, as others have said, would be more helpful to most customers than making them take time off for a daytime meeting with other topics on the agenda. And in summary, thank you very much for a very helpful presentation and for all the work you're doing.
Thank you, Mr. Sauter. Again, we have Jenna.
Hi, sorry, I just wanted to respond to that. Australia, I think, as Paul Mann mentioned, has successfully implemented gray water and rainwater systems in 53% of their households, and because they put together real programs that, and they put energy and investment into that, and it's working. So there is research on Australia that I'm happy to send over to you. They have a comprehensive program as well as policies that are enacted that make that happen. And it's not just kind of a side thought on this, but it's real action that's happening. So I think it's time right now to step up to what is required. I think that we don't have 10 years, and we really need to be putting policies in place that have an immediate impact. And conservation really is, this reuse and capture is what is needed right now for our immediate water resilience. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I do not have any speakers.
Okay. Well, thank you everybody for attending, and your comments are greatly appreciated. If you have any information that you want to share with us, you can, I'm sure, find us online on the district's website, or give us a call. We're here, and we're interested in what you've got to say and any information that you have that might help us in this process. Seeing no other takers, I think we're done for the evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night.
Have a good night.
Right.